All right. Would you turn to exhibit or tab 5 in your binder? And for the record, Your Honor, this is a book, or at least some excerpts from a book called Sexual Orientation Discrimination in an International Perspective. And you recognize that document?
Yes, I co-edited the book.
And this was published when?
I believe in 2007.
Now, could I ask you to turn to page 21, which is one of the excerpts behind the tab 5 there? And the first full paragraph reads as follows. The first complication is defining what one means by sexual orientation, or on being gay, lesbian, bisexual, or heterosexual. Sexuality encompasses several potential distinct dimensions of human behavior, attraction, and personal identity, as decades of research on human sexuality have shown. And in the next passage, you refer to the study that we have been discussing, the National Health and Social Life Survey. Allow me to read on. Perhaps the findings from the 1992 National Health and Social Life Survey reveal the complexity most clearly. One group of respondents, 6.2% of men and 4.4% of women, report feeling sexual attraction to people of the same sex. A smaller group, 4.1% of women and 4.9% of men, have engaged in sexual behavior with someone of the same sex since the age of 18. An even smaller group, 2.8% of men and 1.4% of women, reported that they think of themselves as gay or lesbian for women, or bisexual, and the potential nesting is not necessarily complete or consistent. Some people who have same-sex desires have never acted on them. And even a small number of men who think of themselves as gay or bisexual report no same-sex behavior or attraction, for instance. So, Professor Badgett, there can be a wide variation in the classes of individuals whose sexual orientation is being identified, depending upon whether the dimension being used is the self-identity, the attraction, or the behavior. Is that correct?
Well, there are different numbers. There is overlap, as I note here, although there is some lack of overlap as well for this group. It's not inconsistent with my earlier statement. I mean, most people don't fall into any one of those categories. Most people are heterosexual in terms of both their identity and their behavior and their attractions.
And these survey problems or issues with sexual orientation are generally not present in studying race and sex discrimination, are they?
No, I wouldn't agree with that at all.
I object.
I beg your pardon.
I object. It's outside the scope. Now, I'm not sure that he's doing this in order to save time. That is, it's not totally relevant to the case, but it's certainly outside the scope of what this witness is talking about.
Well, it is outside the scope, but I think it's appropriate. You may proceed on that matter, Mr. Cooper.
Thank you, Your Honor. I'm sorry, did you answer my question?
I started to. I said, no, I don't agree with that statement that you just made.
Okay. Could you turn to page 23 of the excerpt from your book? And the sentence before the last paragraph reads, such issues are generally not present in studying race and sex discrimination, since those characteristics are more reliably observed or reported. Do you not agree with that?
I believe the context is different from what you were looking at earlier, where we were just looking at different definitions. I think in this case we're thinking about the context of doing certain kinds of, well, the context and interpretation of certain sorts of tests, which are asking a somewhat different question, actually.
A word that you use, or that is used in that paragraph that Mr. Cooper pointed out to, is endogeneity.
Yes.
What is endogeneity?
Well, it's another one of those $2 terms. It basically means that some of the factors that we're looking at all the time, at the same time, might be influencing each other. So in this particular case, a good example would be the possibility that this is a broad example, that one's sex, if you were looking at the impact of a lot of factors that influence wages, for instance, we often include things like education and experience and race and sex and occupation, because we know all those things matter in the context of explaining the variation in a wage. But it also turns out that there might be some relationship between these things. So, for instance, a person's sex has a big impact on the occupation that they are in, which we know from other sorts of studies. So in this case, my argument was simply that some of these other factors might influence whether or not someone identifies as gay, lesbian, or bisexual in a way that we wouldn't sort of argue for whether or not someone says that they are a male or female.
I see. So one's occupation may affect how one identifies to other people with respect to sexual orientation. Is that what you're saying?
Well, I was thinking about it more with regard to sex, looking at the impact of being female on wages. So I'm sorry if I confused the matter by bringing the other subject in, but that's the overall context. I mean, I'm looking at this now, I think, because my main concern in this article really didn't have very much to do with race or sex discrimination. I did not talk about some of the very important complications and difficulty in some cases of measuring race. For instance, our census has changed its racial categories in almost every single census that we've had. So this is obviously, these kinds of questions about measurement also come up in that particular context as well. It's just not questions about the measurement of sexual orientation, but also questions about the measurement of many different categories, including race, even though I didn't mention that here.
Mr. Cooper.
Thank you. Professor Badgett, in your expert report, which I believe it's behind tab 1 of the binder in front of you, and it was one of the tabs in the binder that Mr. Boies used with you, and was one of the documents that was now introduced into evidence. You discuss the varying rates of domestic partnerships in the Netherlands. And in the Netherlands, you state in this paragraph that the number of registered partnerships dropped dramatically from 1,500 to 3,000 per year to around 500 to 700 per year when same-sex couples were allowed to marry in 2001, while annual marriages of same-sex couples were twice that number. So, in the Netherlands, since 2001, domestic partnerships did drop, but they remain roughly a third or so of the number of same-sex marriages. Is that right?
Well, they aren't marriages. I would refer to them as formalizations. Yes, same-sex couples with a choice in the Netherlands of which those two they would prefer to have.
And same-sex couples are continuing to select, as you say, domestic partnership or registering as domestic partners at the rate of about 500 to 700, and that's about, again, a third of the number of same-sex marriages.
Yes, registered partnerships, yeah, that's the term. I don't know the exact paragraph you're referring to, but that's my memory of it.
Paragraph 35, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to rush you. Paragraph 35, I was quoting from the bottom of the page on 11. And you also say again in paragraph 35 that different sex couples are also more likely to marry than to have a registered partnership. And Professor, I would like you to turn to your tab number 7 in the binder, and I would like to publish to the screen a demonstrative. Now, tab 7 of your binder contains census data from the Netherlands on the subject of opposite-sex relationships. And what I would like you to take a look at the demonstrative on the screen, if you will, Professor Badgett, which tracks the total number of opposite-sex relationships. And the demonstrative indicates same-sex marriages for, opposite-sex marriages have declined since 2001 at the same time that opposite-sex new registered partnerships have continued to increase over that time period. Is that correct?
Well, these are the numbers of actual marriages. Well, I think in the first place, I'm not sure what you just said is correct. But if you look at the 2001 data and then look at 2002 data, you see a clear increase in the number of marriages. So it does depend somewhat on which of these numbers that you want to look at. But overall, in my opinion, this doesn't tell you anything about what the impact of allowing same-sex couples to marry is.
But does this not indicate that opposite-sex couples are subscribing and using registered partnerships at increasing rates since 2001, and that opposite-sex marriages have actually declined from that period, at least in their trend from some variation?
Okay, I'm going to have to just stop and compare the data that you have in more detail and the exhibit to what you have on the screen, just to make sure that I understand it.
Question, Mr. Cooper?
I thought the witness was a...
Okay, I think I almost understand what you have here. I'm sorry, could you repeat the question, please?
I'm simply asking for your confirmation that opposite-sex couples have used registered partnerships since 2001 in increasing and steadily increasing numbers since that period, and that, as well, the numbers of marriage have trended downward at the same time since 2001.
Well, they have clearly trended downward since 1998, the first year you have on here as well, in terms of the number of opposite-sex marriages. That's what I see in this data. In looking at the new registered partnerships and assessing, what's happening here, I think you would have, as I said earlier, you'd want to look at pre-existing trends, which is the issue for the marriages. You would want to look at other kinds of things that have changed. There was a big change in 2001 for registered partnerships before interpreting what this...
Professor Badgett, this is just a real yes or no question. Your counsel can ask you to explain anything that you would like to explain, but I'm simply asking a yes or no question. Have opposite-sex couples registered partnerships at year 2001 at the number of 1,670 and a number that has increased steadily to 2008 to 7,450?
Well, these appear to be numbers that reflect the numbers that you have given me here, if these in fact come from sources that you have cited.
Thank you. Now, in paragraph 37 of your expert report, you refer to a qualitative data from the Netherlands that you relied upon for the proposition that alternative statuses are viewed as inferior in the Netherlands. That is, registered partnerships are viewed as inferior to marriage. And you've referred to some interviews that you did in the Netherlands. Would you describe those, please?
Interviews?
Yes, please.
I did interviews of same-sex couples to ask them about why they chose to marry or to register as partners or to remain unmarried.
And at least with respect to this paragraph, it was those, on those, the basis of those interviews that you developed, your conclusion that registered domestic partnerships are viewed as socially and culturally second-rate when compared to marriage. Is that right?
I'm sorry, could you tell me the paragraph you're looking at again?
It's 37.
Okay.
Your Honor, I am told that this exhibit actually is not yet in evidence. It's Plaintiff's Exhibit 1257. We have no objection to it being in evidence.
All right, the exhibit number is,
1257.
very well,
The expert report, Your
I
Honor.
beg your pardon.
The expert report, the initial expert report.
Oh, you're entering the expert report?
That's what I understood Mr. Boies to be doing.
It's not usually done, is it, Mr. Boies?
No, it's not. Counsel, I said this document was already in evidence in response to the court's question. My observation is simply that it was not in evidence. Now, I have no objection to it being in evidence. I also have no objection to it not being in evidence. But I just thought the record ought to be clear as to whether it's in evidence or not.
Well, we don't ordinarily introduce expert report when the witness testifies. Is there any reason that we should make an exception in this case?
Not on my account.
Apparently not on Mr. Boies, so let's just move on.
I was misinformed. Again, we are referring to paragraph 37.
Uh-huh.
And it was on the basis of those interviews that you relied for the conclusions that you have identified in paragraph 37 that I quoted previously.
No, I actually cite 3 other sources in that paragraph as well.
Okay, but that was part of your basis for your opinion.
That is correct.
And when did you conduct those interviews?
I conducted them in 2004.
And how many interviews did you conduct?
I interviewed, I believe it was 34 people and 19 different couples.
19 couples.
Yes.
And how were the 19 same-sex couples selected?
Well, they were selected in a very common procedure for people doing qualitative interviews like this. I recruited subjects by tapping into some of my professional networks and my personal networks to start, and then I asked the couples themselves to suggest other couples whom I might interview.
Do you recall the gender breakdown of the couples?
Oh, there were more female than male couples. I don't remember the exact numbers.
Would it refresh your recollection if I suggested there were 6 male couples and 13 females?
That is quite plausible.
And how long did you conduct these interviews?
The interviews lasted roughly an hour to an hour and a half in most cases, and sometimes a little bit more.
And it's true, isn't it, that almost all of the couples had, been formed well before 2001 when the Netherlands legalized same-sex marriage.
That is correct.
Now, all but 2 of the participants had post-secondary education. Is that correct?
Yes, I believe that to be the case. I don't recall exactly, but that sounds right.
But you would agree that the sample itself was probably then skewed towards middle or even upper class couples.
Well, the sample, it was, again, it's not a random sample, so it might have some of the characteristics of my own personal professional networks. And yes, as I discuss in the book in the methodology section.
Do you remember the dominant age cohort?
They were mostly in their 30s and 40s and some in their 50s.
So you don't make any claims about how the experiences of these couples are, do you?
Not in terms of the commonness or frequency, no.
And that's because it would be inappropriate to do so given the non-random sampling development of this grouping?
Well, that is a very common issue with this particular type of research. It's not designed to be generalizable.
Now, none of the same-sex couples that you interviewed had registered partnership after 2001. Is that correct?
I think one couple had shortly after they were allowed to marry, but for some reason They said they decided to go ahead with a registered partnership.
Now, if you had interviewed some same-sex couples who had been registered partnerships after marriage became available, do you think that they would have told you that they chose registered partnerships, a registered partnership over marriage because they believed it to be culturally and socially second-rate to marriage?
Would I have expected them to say that that was the reason? No. No.
Professor Badger, what was AB 205? Do you recognize that?
Well, as I recall, that was the law that added to the rights and responsibilities of registered partnerships here in California.
And you analyzed that law in a report, didn't you, back in 2003?
Yes, I looked at the fiscal impact of that law, of that legislation.
And what was the purpose of that report, to support passage of AB 205?
Well, the purpose of that report was to find out whether or not it would cost the state money or not on net.
And have you analyzed domestic partnership legislation and the fiscal impacts of proposed domestic partnership legislation in other states?
Yes, I have.
And where and when did you do that?
The actual domestic partner legislation, we analyzed that in the state of Washington.
And when was that?
Well, that was a few years ago. I don't remember the exact year. We looked at that same kind of legislation in New Mexico also in 2005, 2006, sometime in that time period. Those are the two that I can recall right now.
Did you prepare a report in connection with the proposal in Oregon?
Yes, that's right. That was a domestic partnership. I think we did do one there too, yeah.
Do you recall when that was?
Well, that was more recent, in the last couple of years.
Would you look at tab 18 of your binder? And is that the document that was prepared by the Williams Institute in connection with the Oregon proposal?
Yes, it is.
And you participated in that?
I did.
And that's DIX 2679, Your Honor. I would like to move it into evidence.
No objection, Your Honor.
Very well, 2679 DIX is admitted.
And in connection with proposals for enactment of domestic partnership legislation, you have supported those, have you not?
No, me personally?
Yeah.
I might have thought they were a good idea. I don't know that I actually supported them in any other kind of meaningful way. I did research on them. That's a different issue.
You don't recall writing any type of newspaper articles about pending domestic partnership legislation?
Well, as I said, I might have. I know I have written op-ed pieces, and sometimes they were related to specific pieces of legislation, and in some cases, I said I thought it was a good idea. Most of the time, I simply said, here's what effect it was going to have.
But you have said that passage of domestic partnership law was a good idea, have you not?
Well, I might have. I haven't looked at those essays for a while.
Would you return to tab 19 of your binder? And that is a reprint from Williams Institute's website of an op-ed piece that you wrote in October of 2006, entitled, "What's Good for Same-Sex Couples is Good for Colorado." Do you recall that now?
Yes, that was another example of domestic partnership legislation that we did some research on.
And you did support that?
Well, actually in this, well, I don't say that I support it anywhere in this essay.
Your Honor, I would like to move that document into evidence. It's
No objection.
DIX 2680.
DIX 2680 is admitted.
Thank you, Your Honor. Now, if you would turn now, Professor Badger, to the document behind tab 9, please. Professor, I would represent to you that these are the domestic partnership statistics for 2000 to 2009 that were provided to us on a certified copy basis by the Secretary of State's office. And this is DIX 2647, Your Honor. I would like to move that into evidence.
No objection.
Did you want to check authentication on this?
Well, no objection, Your Honor. Subject to the ability to check authentication. We have no objection.
Very well, and so subject DIX 2647 is in.
I want to invite your attention, Professor Badger, to the statistics. Again, these are the domestic partnership registration statistics for 2008. Do you see the row of statistics for 2008?
Yes.
And they align with columns for each month, right? And so in each month, the number of domestic partnership registrations is recorded in the appropriate location for the year, correct?
Well, I don't know that these are correct, but I understand the principle, yes.
Okay. And I want to invite your attention to the months during which marriage was legal in California and that began when, do you recall, Professor?
In June of 2008.
Okay, June of 2008. And it essentially ended on Election Day or the day after election, November 4th of that year, correct?
Yes.
And so for the first full month that marriage was available, how many domestic partnerships were registered? That's July of that year.
356.
When you look right above it for the number of domestic partnerships that were registered in 2007, you see that the number there is 510, correct?
Yes.
Okay. And so, indeed, the domestic partnership registrations did decline from the previous month, but they still maintained at roughly 70%, if my math is correct, of the previous months. Of the previous years, I beg your pardon, previous years' domestic partnership registrations, correct?
Whatever the percentage is, yes, on some portion.
If you look at the number directly beneath the number of registrations for July of 2008, and that is the number for July of 2009, you see that that number there is 332 domestic partnerships, which is actually about 24 fewer than had been registered in July of 2008, when marriage was an alternative for these domestic partnerships, correct?
Yes, it was an option in July of 2008, but not in July of 2009.
That's right. That's right. And the number of registered partnerships actually declined from the number that were registered in July of 2008 to July of 2009, correct?
Yes.
And in the next month, August, we see the figure 286 domestic partnerships were registered, which was about 60% or so, if my math is correct, of the 489 from the previous year, the August of 2007, and about 70% of the number the following year, 412. So there was still a very substantial number of registered partnerships in August of 2008, correct?
There were 286, yes.
And if we could compare these relationships for the other 2 months, the 2 full months in the period when same-sex marriage was lawful, but if you just look at the numbers, for example, for all 11 months in 2008, if you look at the numbers for all 12 months in 2008, you see there's 4,489 throughout the year. And the number for just 11 months in 2009 is 4,067 registered domestic partnerships, correct?
Yes, that's the number, yes.
And if you and I ask you to accept my math on this. If you eliminate December of 2008 from the number of domestic partnerships registered in that year, and you compare the first 11 months of 2008 to the first 11 months of 2009, the number of registered partnerships is 4,065 in 2008 versus 4,067 in 2009. I ask you to accept my mathematical representation.
Okay.
So, the rate of registration of domestic partnership was quite substantial during the period when marriage was available, and in fact, is completely comparable to the number of registered partnerships in 2009. Is that not correct?
Well, that's the number that I calculated earlier with just sort of different time period of 2007. Yes, I acknowledge that there were registered partnerships during the time that marriage was an option also.
Do you believe that these California same-sex couples chose domestic partnerships over marriage because they believed it to be culturally and socially second-rate when compared to marriage?
Objection, Your Honor, misstates the exhibit.
Objection overruled.
Ms. Batten?
Well, I don't know that some of those 18,000 couples who married didn't also register a domestic partnership in order to hedge their bets against the outcome of the election. So I don't know exactly the conclusion we could draw from comparing 2008 to 2009.
I would like you to turn now back to your expert report, please, and paragraph 40. Now, in your testimony and in this report, you argue that there are a number of same-sex couples who will not register a domestic partnership, but who would get married if they had the option to do so.
Yes.
And this is the place in your expert report where you attempt to quantify what that number is. Is it not?
Yes.
Okay, and I would just like to go through that paragraph with you. It is possible to estimate the increase in the number of currently non-registered same-sex domestic partners who would marry if they could and thereby gain the legal protections of marriage. To estimate the eventually count of married same-sex couples, I multiplied the proportion of couples marrying in Massachusetts between 2004 and 2008 calculated earlier, which is 64% by the number of same-sex couples in California, 84,397 to get the number of same-sex couples likely to marry in California, which is 54,014. That is 64% of the 84,400. Next, I subtract the number of currently registered same-sex domestic partnerships in California, calculated earlier as 46,266. The difference between likely marriages and current domestic partnerships is 7,748. Now, Dr. Badgett, you calculate this off the number of same-sex couples in California, right?
Right.
And where does that figure come from?
Well, that figure comes, the 84,000 came from the American Community Survey in 2008.
In 2008.
Yes.
And that number was apparently an improvement in previous numbers of calculations of same-sex couples. Is that correct?
Well, in the 2008 American Community Survey, the Census Bureau made some improvements in their processing of old data that I think led to better counts of couples, yes.
And it reduced significantly the previous estimates that it not of same-sex couples.
In both Massachusetts and California, yes.
Professor, of the 84,000 same-sex couples in California, how many of those are married?
I'm sorry, could you ask that again?
I'm asking, how many of the 84,400 same-sex couples in California, according to the ACS 2008 survey, how many are married?
How many are married, or how many are?
Well, wasn't it in your estimate, I think you testified to earlier, that there are 18,000 same-sex couples who were married during that period in 2008?
Well, that was the estimate of the number who married in that time period. There may be couples in California who married in other places too. Canada, Massachusetts.
Well, now, shouldn't those individuals be deducted from the 84,000 before you arrive at your 7,550 estimate of people who would get married but will not enter into a domestic partnership? That is before you actually apply your 64% multiplier from Massachusetts, shouldn't they be deducted?
No, they would just be part of that's 64% who actually did marry. That's where those 18,000 would be.
Well, what you're saying here, as I read the paragraph, is that there are non-registered domestic partners who, if permitted, would get married, and that those non-registered domestic partners are the number that you derive when you subtract 64% of 84,000. That is 54,000 from the 84,000, correct?
I'm afraid I got lost in the numbers.
This is
I'm sure the witnesses figured it out, though.
Oh, we need a blackboard.
And that's why I figured you'd figured it out.
This is indeed a complicated methodology that the witness has used. So, 64% of the 84,000 couples in California are the number likely to marry, about 54,014.
Yes.
And it's within that the 18,000 couples who actually ended up being able to get married would fall into. They would be part of that 54,000, but they are already married. They are already married. Of the 84,000 same-sex couples, 18,000, according to your estimate, are already married.
Yes.
And so they certainly wouldn't be marrying again, would they?
No, they wouldn't be marrying again, but there's still a substantial group that would be part of that 54,000 who are not currently registered domestic partners. So there may be an additional 36,000 or so who would get married if they could, on top of that 18,000. Adding those two groups together and subtracting off the number of currently registered domestic partnerships, it would give you about 7,000 people who would get married if they were able to.
If you deducted the 18,000 from the 84,000, you would not get 7,750, would you, Dr. Badgett?
No, but I think it's appropriate to include the 18,000 who not only want to get married, but happen to be able to get married and did get married during that period of time as part of the prediction of the number of same-sex couples likely to marry in California.
You think it's appropriate to include them in the number of people who would get married if they could, the ones?
They have shown that they already would. Yes.
Okay, they already are.
That's right. That's a pretty good measure.
How are you doing on time, Mr. Cooper?
Your Honor, this would be a perfectly fine time to take our lunch break.
Well, that would be fine. How much longer do you think you have with this witness?
I think I have a couple of hours, Your Honor.
Another couple of hours?
I do.
Well, then we better proceed on a full stomach. We'll take our lunch and recess at this time. Let's resume at 1:30.
Thank you.
Mr. Cooper, you may continue your cross-examination of this witness.
Thank you, Your Honor, and good afternoon. And good afternoon, Professor Badgett. Would you turn to the document behind tab 11 of your binder, please? This is PX 1271. I think it's also listed as PX 1039. I do believe it's been introduced by now into evidence. but this is a document entitled Same-Sex Spouses and Unmarried Partners in the American Community Survey 2008. It's a Williams Institute document. Do you recognize it?
Yes, I do.
Okay. And it's been your colleague, Gary Cates, is that right?
Yes, it is.
Okay, 2009. And I want you to turn to page I, little I, in the executive summary, and the first bullet point on that page, and I'll read it, if I may. The 2008 estimate of nearly 565,000 same-sex couples marked a decline from the peak estimate of 780,000 couples in 2006. This is likely a result of improvements made to the 2008 ACS survey instrument and in data processing procedures. And then the next little bullet point under that says, the entire decline in the number of reported same-sex spousal couples. Now, we had a short exchange about this earlier this morning, Dr. Badgett. Could you describe what the nature of the census of the ACS improvement, or at least last revision of its instrument, and the process that brought about this reduction in the estimates from previous years?
Yes, I'd be happy to. My understanding is that the Census Bureau made two changes that resulted in this change in the number. One of them, well, actually, maybe I should just describe the overall issue. The question is, what happens when a same-sex couple says that one of the parties is the husband or wife of the other person? And in the case of, well, the concern here is that some of the individuals might actually be different sex couples who had marked the sex box wrong.
Just miscoded
That's right, yeah.
the box.
That's right. So the two things the Census Bureau did were designed to reduce the number of inadvertent markings of that box, of the sex box. And so that's the sort of general thing that they're trying to do. So they did two things. First, they said they were going to change the form, and instead of having a fairly complex instead of having a fairly complex form that seemed to give some respondents trouble, they streamlined it. It actually ends up looking more like the census form now, where each individual in the household is marked in relationship to the household or reference person in the household. The second thing that they did was to note that sometimes respondents actually make a mistake on the form, realize it, and then corrected it. But the Census Bureau procedure did not allow for their data entry people to take into account that correction. Because what it looked like to the data entry people was that person had marked both boxes, male and female. And the rule, the processing rule that the Census Bureau used to have was to just take the first box, which is male. But in this new revised procedure, what they realized was that sometimes you can tell exactly what people are trying to do on those forms. And so they allowed the data entry people to make a judgment about whether or not it looked like they were correcting it and changing it. So they believe they have a better data on the sex of individuals and that they've reduced this miscoding problem that resulted in some different sex couples who are married being inadvertently put into the data as same-sex couples.
Thank you, thank you. And let me ask you to page back in this document to the appendix, and in particular to the appendix table 2, page number, there is no page number, so it would be appendix table 2. It's just before you get to the references. And it is a 2-page table of statistics relating to each state. Do you see that?
Yes, I do.
Okay, and if you look at the statistics for California under the column marked same-sex couples, in the total column you have 84,397. And that's the number that is used in your export report, and we discussed earlier this morning for the total number of same-sex couples in California, right?
Yes, that's correct.
And as you go across that, the row pertaining to California, the number of same-sex spouses according to the ACS 2008 survey, is 23,403. Continue on to the right on that row. The number in this survey for same-sex unmarried partners is 60,994, which is just the difference between the total number and the number of same-sex spouses. And then to the far right-hand column is the number 18,000 legal marriages. Now those 18,000 legal marriages represent the estimate that you and your colleagues made with respect to California. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay, and so it's there's a difference between the estimate from the census of 23,000 and and your estimate of 18,000. But I take it those are just differences in the methodologies that were used.
Yes, they are very, very different methodologies. That's the simplest way to answer it, yes.
Okay. Now, this morning we talked about in your paragraph 40 where you use the marriage rate over a 4-year period in Massachusetts of 64% to calculate the number of marriages that you would estimate would take place in California if same-sex marriage were lawful, of the people who will not enter or register a domestic partnership. Now, that assumes, though, does it not, that same-sex marriage rates in Massachusetts are a reliable predictor of what same-sex marriage rates would be in California, correct?
Yes.
And you are aware of any reasons why that might not be so?
No, I think it would be the case that it's a reliable predictor.
Now, in Massachusetts, same-sex couples do not have the option of registering as domestic partnerships, do they?
No, that's correct.
And it's either a marriage or cohabitation in Massachusetts.
Well, there may have been some same-sex couples in Massachusetts who had gotten a civil union in Vermont or a domestic partnership in California. That's possible.
But in terms of actually recognizing under Massachusetts law a same-sex relationship, it's just marriage, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
And in California, if Proposition 8 is invalidated, same-sex couples will be able to choose between marriage, cohabitation, or domestic partnership, will they not?
I don't know. It's possible that a legislature would get rid of domestic partnerships.
Well, at least right now, unless the legislature takes action right now, that would be the case if Proposition 8 were invalidated, would it not?
Well, the legislature of Vermont and Connecticut and New Hampshire ended the civil union status when they allowed same-sex couples to marry. So California might well do the same thing. I don't know what they'll do.
Oh, but there was a period of time when either status was available to Californians, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Now, I want to refer you to your deposition. I think it's behind tab 3 of your binder, and I want you to refer you to that page 179, line 7. Let me know when you're there. Have you found a page?
Yes.
At line 7, the question is asked, and so I just want to know whether, in your opinion, the consequences, whatever they may be, of same-sex marriage in Massachusetts will be identical to the consequences of same-sex marriage in California. Answer. Again, so the consequences is to married individuals? Question. We can start there. That would be fine. Answer. Some of the benefits of marriage might differ slightly across the different states. In terms of the consequences to individuals, I think that the other difference is that in California, people would have a choice of domestic partnership, which they don't have in Massachusetts. So those are two differences between the states. Do you recall that testimony?
I do. That was one place that we discussed this issue. I believe there were some others.
Okay. Now, if in Massachusetts had the option of domestic partnership available, presumably some people would elect to register domestic partnerships, just as they did in California when both were available, and just as they do in the Netherlands. Do you agree with that?
I don't know.
Well, if that premise is accurate, shouldn't your 64% marriage rate be adjusted in order to account for the same-sex couples in Massachusetts who would have opted for a domestic partnership if that had been available?
Well, I don't think so, actually. If you look at the numbers, the percentages of same-sex couples who married just in those 6 months, as I believe I mentioned, the initial kind of voting with their feet for marriage was roughly 17 to 20% of California's same-sex couples. And well, if you think about it, you just double that so that you've got a whole year instead of just 6 months, that you have almost the same first year taken up rate of marriage for same-sex couples in Massachusetts. That's a very clear suggestion that couples will be responding in the same way. Excuse me. I'm sorry. Could I get some more water, please?
Yes, we'll take care of that.
Thank you.
So I take it your answer is no, you don't think that your 64% metric should be adjusted to account for that point?
No, it might be that many couples will get married, and 64% of the couples will get married, and even more will also have domestic partnership.
Now, there are also some disincentives for California same-sex couples to get married that Massachusetts same-sex couples do not have. Is that not true?
I'm not aware of any.
I want you to turn to tab 12 in your binder, and in particular to page 13. I'm sorry, before you do, if you let me back up, Your Honor, forgive me. I was advised by one of my colleagues that I was wrong in my impression that PX 1271, the document we previously discussed, had been admitted into evidence, and I would like to do so now.
No objection.
1271 is admitted.
Okay, and the document behind tab 12 is entitled Marriage, Registration, and Dissolution by Same-Sex Couples in the United States. It is PX 1263. Do you recognize that document?
I do.
And you participated in its preparation, didn't you?
I did.
In July of 2008?
Yes.
Okay, and if you will turn to page 13, please. Now, in figure 8, there are 3 bars in a chart indicating the average monthly registration of domestic partnerships in California in 3 different periods. The period 2000 to 2001, the period 2002 to 2004, and the period 2005 to the present. And of course, the present was, at least through July 2008. And it indicates that was after 2005, after AB 205 had been passed, domestic partnerships actually became less popular as an option among same-sex couples. Is that right?
No, I don't think that indicates that at all.
No? Well, it does certainly indicate that there was a decline, does it not, in the average monthly registrations after 2005?
Well, there was a decline probably because of fulfilling some of the pent-up demand earlier on.
The pent-up demand for domestic partnership?
For some form of legal recognition. In this case, domestic partnerships, yes.
And you don't think that the passage of AB 205 had anything to do with it?
In terms of the numbers?
Uh-huh.
No, I don't think it had anything to do with it. But it's hard to, I think we note this in the report. It's actually very hard to deal with California because the law changed so many times.
Well, now, but AB 205 actually was the statute that extended quite comprehensively all of the rights and benefits of marriage to domestic partnerships, attempted essentially to equalize the two statuses, correct?
Well, that appears to have been one of the goals, yes.
Now, turn to the next page, if you will, and Table 3 there has statistics for a number of jurisdictions, including California, with respect to dissolutions of legally recognized same-sex couple relationships by year. And you'll note that in 2004, the number of dissolutions spiked enormously. It went from 733 in 2003, which itself was up from 296 in 2002, to a much larger number in 2004 of 2,513 dissolutions. So not only were the new registrations after 2005, did they decline significantly, but in the anticipation of 2005, dissolution spiked. Isn't that right?
Well, there was an increase, and most of that increase was in the last couple of months of 2004, so there was a spike. The question about what that means is a different matter.
Well, doesn't your report suggest an explanation, Professor Badgett, for what that means? I refer you to, again, back to page 13, in the first full paragraph beginning registration. In the second sentence there, it reads, in California, domestic partnership was established in 2000 and then significantly expanded in 2002 and again in 2005, when community property was established and the legislature decreed that domestic partners would have all the rights and responsibilities associated with marriage. And then in the next paragraph, towards the end, actually, it's the last sentence of the paragraph, the report, while the 2002 expansion of domestic partner rights in California led to higher monthly registrations, the rate slowed somewhat after the comprehensive forms of 2005 that included community property, although the month figures were still much higher than in the earlier phase. Elsewhere in the report, the author suggests that subjecting the couples to the community property regime that came about as a result of the passage of AB 205 was the explanation for the decline in monthly registrations and the spike in dissolutions just before the statute was passed. Do you see that?
Yes, I want to look at our footnotes. So the question is whether or not community property might have had something to do with that spike in dissolutions. It's a difficult question because no one studied this a great deal or in a great deal of detail, and I thought maybe I'm just remembering my book or some other publication where we talk about the honest confusion that was apparent for some couples about what the tax and financial consequences of having community property might be. I can refer you to many media accounts of this phenomenon that was noted that journalists talked to individuals who said their relationships were not ending, but their tax advisors their accountants had no idea what the potential consequences might be, and that to be on the safe side, they were dissolving their relationships in that case. And, I'm not an attorney, but I do know that subsequent to the change in the law, there were lots of questions that had to be answered. So there was much confusion because domestic partnership is something that, that was created here in California, this particular version of it. So I think no one knows exactly what that was going to mean.
Where in this report do you and your co-authors discuss those points?
Well, in this particular report, I'm not finding it and kind of looking through it very quickly. It's possible that I'm thinking about a different context where we've talked about it. I don't know. As I said, it may have been in my book.
I'm sorry.
I don't know.
Let me refer you to a footnote on page 33. It's footnote number 18, and listed there are 9 community property states. And Massachusetts is not listed as among them, is it?
No.
Okay, let me now invite your attention to paragraph 45 of your expert report.
Okay.
Now, this is the paragraph, is it not, or the place in your report where you attempt to quantify the number of unemployed partners who would not be eligible for health care benefits from the employer. Is that essentially correct?
Well, they're not necessarily unemployed. They are either not employed or their employers don't offer them benefits.
And how many uncovered partners did you calculate? I think the number is actually over on page 16 towards the end of the paragraph.
Yes, it's almost 1,600, 1,581 partners.
And in that sentence where you identify that number, you say that leaves approximately 1,581 uncovered partners who I assume would be covered if they were spouses. So you assume that all of those uncovered partners would qualify and would, if they were part of a married couple, would be able to get employee benefits as spouses, correct?
Yes.
I want you to refer now to tab 13 of your binder. Your Honor, this is PX 1261, and I think it was introduced into evidence by Mr. Boies. It's the California Employer Health Benefits Survey dated December 2008. Now, this was the survey you relied on in connection with your opinions on the subject matter. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay, and I want you to turn to page 4, please. Now, according to this survey, California employers offer coverage to their employees, or at least I should have said 70% of all California employers offer coverage to their employees. 30% don't offer any health coverage, correct?
That's correct.
Okay, and this says nothing, and it can't find anything in the survey, frankly, that says or that would inform as to whether or not the 70% of California employers who offer health care benefits to their employees also offer family benefits. That is, benefits that would extend to a spouse as opposed to individual benefits. But it's clear, is it not, then, that one can't assume that every one of these uncovered partners would be covered if they were a spouse?
Well, my understanding from talking to the person who works with the California Healthcare Foundation, that it was her understanding that virtually all of these employers also offer spousal coverage.
Okay, so even if all 70 do, or all 70% of California employees offer family coverage, only 70% do.
Yes, and I took that into account in my calculation.
You did take that into account.
I did. I think I said so in the paragraph that you referred to earlier.
And turn as well to page 18, please. Now, in your paragraph 45, you further assume that each one of the uncovered employees would have to pay $5,909 in a premium to obtain their coverage. That would be a premium expense that the employer would otherwise bear by himself. That's your assumption in your paragraph, correct?
Yes.
Now, on page 18, the survey indicates that employers rarely pay all of the family coverage. There is a significant portion that the employee himself or herself has to actually pay. And according to this survey, the employee's share is essentially $3,200 as compared to the $10,000 and change contribution by the employer. Did you account for that in your analysis?
I don't think I did in calculating the absolute total, additional total spending for couples, to the extent that take-up rates are quite high for health insurance when it's offered. But I did not take that into account in adding up the total now.
Well, speaking of take-up rates, turn to the page number 9 in your tab. Now, not all employees are eligible for coverage by their employer, correct?
That's correct. Sometimes employers require them to be full-time, for instance.
Exactly. And according to this, in California, 79% of employees are eligible for employer coverage. This, again, doesn't tell us whether that's individual coverage or family coverage or both. But at least 79% are eligible for individual coverage, but only 79%. 20% are not eligible at all. Isn't that correct?
That's correct.
Okay, and now not all the eligible employees actually take it up, and in light of the cost of the premium, that certainly is not surprising. And according to this survey, 83% of those who are eligible actually take it up. So the take-up rate, while it is high, it is certainly not 100%, correct?
Yes, that's what this suggests, yes.
So the net of that is 65%. Only 65% of employers are actually covered by their employer in the state of California. Is that correct?
Yes, I believe that's what that says, within firms offering coverages, yes.
Yes, okay. So let's turn now all the way to paragraph 91 of your expert report. And actually, perhaps it makes more sense to turn to paragraph 90. And this is a series of paragraphs that contains your analysis and your calculations relating to the issue of wedding-related business generation and tax revenue, correct?
Yes.
Which you testified specifically about in your direct testimony. And I do want now to focus on paragraph 91. And in this paragraph, you're referring back to the study. I think it was introduced in direct testimony, and you had a conversation with Mr. Boies about the study you had done on this subject previous to your expert report, correct?
Yes.
Okay, in this paragraph, you're referring to the study, to that study. In that study, my colleagues and I used methods and data that are consistent with our prior studies. We estimated that the number of couples who would marry, if allowed, by predicting the number of couples that would wish to marry in California and subtracting the number of couples that already did marry. Based on figures from Massachusetts discussed previously, we predict that approximately half of California's same-sex couples would marry in the first 3 years of having the option to do so. Half of the 120,639 same-sex couples in California counted in the American Community Survey, an average of the 2004 and 2006 surveys would be 51,320 couples. Now, previously in your expert report, in at least 3 different occasions, you used the number of same-sex couples as 84,000, which we looked at a moment ago from the ACS 2008 survey, correct?
Yes.
Okay, but now you're using the substantially higher number of same-sex couples in California that are derived from the previous surveys, which the census has now basically said were inflated. Is that correct?
Yes, but I'm not worried about that, though.
And using that number, you have concluded that 51,320 couples, same-sex couples, would marry if over a 3-year period, correct?
That's right. We're just looking at a 3-year period now.
All right. Now, let's continue with paragraph 92. We estimated the number of legal same-sex marriages between June 16, 2008 and November 4, 2008 through a survey of California county clerks that allowed us to compare marriages in the sum of 2007 and 2008, resulting in an estimate of 18,000 same-sex couples who married. And we've talked about the 18,000 same-sex marriage estimate previously. I wanted to skip, for purposes of time only, the next 2 sentences and pick up with, we use data from the San Francisco County Clerk's Office to determine the percentage of out-of-state same-sex marriages that occurred between Proposition 8's passage, then you have in parentheticals 19.3%, and applied that percentage to the entire state. Of the 18,000 married couples, we estimated the number of resident and out-of-state same-sex couples married in California to be 14,384 and 3,746 respectively. So, Professor Badgett, using the 19.3% metric from San Francisco, you applied that to the 18,000 estimate of same-sex marriages and determined how many were effective. Of that number were in-state and how many could be estimated as likely being out-of-state, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. I can't get these 2 numbers to sum up to 18,000. The 14,384 and the 3,746. They're not far off, but my calculation is 18,130. But
Perhaps you could ask if there's an explanation.
that is my question, Your Honor. Thank you.
All right, good.
My guess is a typo.